I'm recording this.
Oh, Brian. Okay, yeah. And then on. Okay, sounds good.
All right. Welcome everyone to lecture about the environment. I usually like to make sure I'm kind of high energy for this one because this is my really the most important issue I think I get to discuss um, ever, no matter in what context. I always get hyped up when I get an environment question. Whenever I get to talk to people about the environment, I don't enjoy it per se because it's all bad things, but like it's something I'm passionate about. So feel free to ask questions. Some of the takes I say in here might not be what you're used to, but some of the solutions you might not be familiar with. But yeah, let's get started. So when talking about the environment, there are always I usually just describe it in two words. We're screwed. That's how I usually like to frame it. Largely because, well, we are, okay? The environment is not in a good place. With climate change, especially, the entire world is really not doing well in its response to rising CO2 emissions and the greenhouse effect it has on the planet and the planet's temperature. And this causes ripple effects throughout the world in all sorts of other categories as well. And if there's really one thing you can take away from this presentation, I'll say it at the beginning, it's that climate change is really a threat multiplier in that it legitimately makes everything else worse. If you think of a bad thing in this world, climate change makes it worse. From racism to poverty to social inequalities to worsening levels of biodiversity, lack of fisheries, like fishery collapse. Almost every bad thing you can think about, deforestation, climate change plays a role. Disease spreading as well, and wars, famine, etc. So let's talk about why for a second. Let's talk about what's going on in the world that makes the climate problem so severe and just so bad for everybody living on the planet right now. What is the status quo? Status quo is this. The climate emergency is already here and it's just going to get worse. Okay? Around a year and 9 months ago, there was a landmark October 2018 report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There was a lot of buzz in the news about this, but if you guys forgot, that's fine, right? In 2018, an IPCC report came out suggesting that a climate catastrophe was imminent by 2040. Now, climate catastrophe is kind of like a vague term. What does that mean? Basically, they were saying that if you read what the report was saying, or if you read newspaper articles based on the report, you would essentially learn that we were going to overshoot the Paris Climate Accords pretty drastically, okay? So the Paris Climate Accords were signed in 2015 and basically said that we wanted, as a best case scenario, to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And just 5 years out from that Paris Climate Accord deal, we realized that that goal is not only unrealistic, but it's basically a pipe dream. A 1.5 degrees Celsius increase is still possible, but is very unlikely. It would require not only exorbitant carbon taxes, $27,000 per ton on average, but also probably carbon capturing technology as well, which I will discuss later. And here's what some people don't even realize, okay? When we talk about Paris and climate change and degrees, we have to realize that keeping the world below 1.5 degrees is like the best case scenario, but it's still not even good, okay? Warming the entire world by 1.5 degrees Celsius on average would still have drastic consequences. And I'll obviously be talking about what this means, what the consequences mean for the world at large shortly after. And my internet's been having like a few problems today. Yeah, so just tell me if I'm breaking up or something like that. and then I can just pause and then re-say what I was just saying, because sometimes, yeah, my internet today is weird. So basically, let's talk about what we would have to do, okay? In order to reach our Paris goals, which, as I already told you, would not even be good, right? 1.5 degrees Celsius would still have very bad consequences. Cutting emissions to zero right now wouldn't even be enough, okay? Because of a phenomenon called climate lag. Basically, the emissions you put out into the atmosphere today do not have an effect on warming until around 40 years down the road. So right now, our warming in 2020 is the result of the emissions we made as a society in 1980, basically around there. That's the dogma that's generally accepted. So therefore, if we cut emissions to zero now, we would still be feeling the brunt of carbon warming until like 2060, just because of the stuff we've already put into the environment. And guess what? This landmark report suggests that a climate catastrophe is already imminent by 2040. So cutting emissions to zero literally is not even enough. We would have to contribute net negative carbon to the environment, which means that we would have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, there are a couple ways to do this. For example, trees pull carbon out of the atmosphere, right? But like what we're focusing on here is just carbon capture technology, where it's like a new form of tech where we set up like machines and stuff like that would suck carbon out. But as of its current state, current carbon capture tech would require 2 to 3 times the size of India, the whole country, full of carbon capture plants, just to get us down to Paris, which is completely unfeasible. But in other words, if we even want a chance to get to Paris, we need to reverse course immediately. But only 7 of the 195 Paris signatories are even on course for their goals. And these 7 are like the smallest, are generally very, very small countries that don't contribute much anyway. So that's the status quo. If we keep on going the way we're going, not only are we gonna blow past 1.5, we're gonna skim past 2 like nothing, skip past 3, maybe settle on 4, and shoot for the moon with 5 degrees Celsius, right? And once that happens, the catastrophic impact will be felt by everyone. Because let's be real, okay? If it just warms by 1.5, just warms by 1.5, or just warms by 2, there are some areas where like you might not feel it that much. Like for example, I live in a Chicago suburb. We might not be that badly hit by 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, but you can bet if it actually gets up to like 4, 5 degrees warming, the entire world will be drastically different. Sea levels rising, droughts, harvest seasons will change. I'm not a scientist by any means, so I'm not going to tell you exactly what the degree differences mean, but there will be enormous economic costs associated, and human costs as well, associated with every single 1/10 of a degree of average warming.
Oh, Brian, I have one question, and then I guess one other thing to add. First, I think, going back to Brian's point, climate change isn't like this yes or no thing. It's not like there is climate change happening or there isn't. It's the scale, right? And so Brian talked about, that means like 2 degrees Celsius is worse than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is worse than 1 degree Celsius of change in our overall temperature. So there's that to consider. But also, just remind me, Brian, do we touch up on the Paris Climate Accords?
I think I touched on it a bit. I explained it like earlier, but basically I can give you guys a quick rundown. It's not in this presentation, but in 2015, like 195 countries got together and basically said like, we're going to stop warming. So they set a goal of this 1.5 degrees Celsius increase by 2100. The problem with these Paris Accords was that it wasn't binding, right? So there was no enforcement mechanism. Yeah, Nan, do you want to add something?
Like last phrase, they 195 countries set a goal about, because you sort of broke up there.
Okay, yeah, about like keeping the degrees Celsius warming below 1.5 and 2 degrees in a worst case by 2100. But the problem was that Paris just wasn't binding, right? There was no enforcement mechanism to actually ensure that these countries were following through. So 5 years into the deal, it turns out to be pretty worthless. And especially since like the legitimacy is lost since the US like pulled out and stuff like that. So really, Paris has been toothless so far and really not a success at all. So that's the
yeah, and I guess one other thing to add. The United States is the only nation that is not a signatory to the Paris Climate Change Accords, if I recall correctly. Like, there are literal active war zones, like Yemen even, that are signatories to the Paris Climate Accords.
Yeah, the US is just, well, here's the deal, right? The deal is that though, like, even though the entire rest of the world has signed on to these Paris Accords and ostensibly like recognizes climate change as a problem, they don't have the actions to back up their words, at least not right now, right? Even though every single other country has signed the Paris Accords, they're only doing it because they know they don't have to follow up on it, right? There's no enforcement mechanism. So really, Paris has just been a complete disaster for the last 5 years. So this is the obvious question. Don't we still have time? Like, come on. There has to be something we can do. And yes, we do, in theory, have time. That report said that like we really have until 2030 to reverse course. Now, there have been more recent reports suggesting that that report was too conservative in its estimates and that things are actually accelerating faster than scientists predicted. And that would be even scarier, right? But in theory, yes, we do have until 2030 to get our stuff together. The issue is there is no indication under any government in the world, except for maybe like Costa Rica, that we are committed to getting ourselves off of fossil fuels and into a carbon neutral economy. There is just no indication or any commitment for people to be doing that. Now, in recent years, like in the last year, Biden has released a climate plan, right? The EU released a really ambitious climate plan. So yeah, there are signs that something may be happening. But like, we have to see the action before we buy the words, right? And here's a stat that really, really puts into place like how bad we're doing. 350 parts per million is considered the safe amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? As a baseline. In 2017, we hit 400 parts per million. So not only have we gotten close to that benchmark for safe CO2, we've blown past it and more. So this is like the last science I'm going to talk about in this presentation, right? The last pure like scientific type deal, because we're not scientists. We aren't scientists. We're like dealing with policy here. But this just shows you how far away we are from actually getting this problem under control, because we blew past every barrier.
And
yeah.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I was just saying how this is going to be like, I'm not going to talk a lot about science this presentation because we're more interested about the policy. But this stat just shows like how many barriers and checkpoints we've just blown past and how many we're just continuing and going to continue to blow past in the future, right? And one other thing that's even scarier is the fact that the Arctic permafrost is thawing fast. One of the most ironic things about climate change is it's a positive feedback loop, okay? Once the planet gets warmer, it continues to get warmer faster, right? The rate of change increases. And largely, this permafrost is a good reason why. Underneath Arctic permafrost, there's a ton of methane, which is even worse as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So when Arctic permafrost melts, the methane escapes, making it warm faster, making a positive feedback loop. And that's one of the things scientists are more concerned about. Like past the 2018 report, people are worried about Arctic permafrost thawing faster than anyone could have ever expected. This is going at unprecedented rates, okay? And when it goes at unprecedented rates, the Earth warms faster and faster. And also, something to keep in mind, not lighthearted at all, but there are also ancient diseases hidden under Arctic permafrost that have just been kept there for eons and eons because they can't escape. Well, once the Arctic permafrost melts into water and that water starts going places, you can bet we will be seeing some more novel diseases in the future from eons ago that humans have never encountered before. That's just some food for thought. So, how have we gotten to this point? Just a quick background on why the climate crisis is so sudden. It's largely because we didn't understand the background really until like the late 60s, and then throughout the 70s and the 80s, some prominent US scientists really started digging into this issue. Like the climate is actually changing and it's because of human activity. Beforehand, they generally, like some people understood the fact that human industrial activity could have caused some warming, but like people didn't understand the mechanisms. In the 70s and 80s, we really started understanding why this happened. And people were like, we got to stop this. It was a pretty nonpartisan deal. So up to 1989, pretty much everyone was in agreement that like, yeah, sure, we need to get this under control. And in 1989, a binding treaty was proposed. So this is the opposite of Paris. It would be binding. Almost everyone was on board. If they had signed, they would have been obligated to keep carbon emissions down. So this was a binding treaty, very important. But it got derailed solely because of the US delegation to that treaty, which meant that, yes, the US essentially historically is responsible for our climate debacle, okay? Largely because oil, gas, coal giants in the US realized that, holy moly, we won't be able to do what we've been doing if we sign this treaty. So they really lobbied H.W. Bush's administration hard and stymied the global efforts. One of the greatest disasters really in the history of the world. I think that's fair to say, really. Without a binding treaty, there's continued industrialization across the world. China, India, developing countries, and developed countries just pumping out carbon at high rates. Continued reliance on fossil fuels drove carbon increases. And even like if you would have argued that like these countries would have industrialized and put carbon out anyway, like the binding treaty would have stopped like most developed countries from over polluting. So we'd have a much easier situation to deal with, buy us more time. But disinformation and lobbying have infiltrated every single major nation. And while most countries now recognize climate change as a problem, obviously in the US, it's still a big point of contention. And that's a very, very, very hard issue to overcome because there's just so much money into making sure that we don't deal with the issue here at home.
Oh, Brian?
Yeah.
Just two things to add. Number one, in case you're more interested in reading about the global climate efforts of like the 1990s, it's called the Kyoto Protocol. Pretty interesting stuff to read about. And the second thing was like, yes, climate change wasn't as politicized before, but honestly, I would go an even bolder statement and say though that, you know, even like in the Reagan administration, for example, where he tore down Jimmy Carter's largely symbolic solar panels in the White House just to like signal his beliefs on the issue. Like it's clear that people like even Ronald Reagan haven't always been the most friendly for our environment either.
Yeah, I mean, we really started seeing a shift though. Like for example, Nixon, as a Republican president, created the EPA, and then just 2 administrations later, Reagan started dismantling it. So it was a rapid shift, really, just created because of lobbying and disinformation. And what Anant was saying about the Kyoto protocols, this was actually a different treaty in 1989 that was binding. I'm going to look up the name for it. It was.
Oh, so it wasn't Kyoto?
It wasn't Kyoto. It was like a UN meeting in 1989 that was supposed to be that was supposed to be like a meeting to address it that was going to be binding. There was a great piece in the New York Times magazine about it. It's called "The Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change." Highly recommend. It goes through that detail. It will make you mad, but yeah, it's a good piece. So yeah, Now I've gotten over like history, kind of like the science. Now we're going to talk about what extempers actually care about. Why does this matter? What are the practical impacts of a warming planet? Okay. Why is this crisis such a big deal? The answer is quite simple. As the planet warms, it's what's called a threat multiplier. Okay. It just multiplies every single threat. And here are a few of the biggest threats it's going to multiply. The biggest one and the most impactful, I think, is this. The fallout of climate change is akin to a rich arsonist getting off free. The impacts are disproportionately felt by the poorest and most vulnerable worldwide. Okay? The biggest thing to remember is that climate change exacerbates inequality. It keeps the rich rich and it keeps the poor poor. Why? Well, I'll just give you a quick anecdotal example. This isn't one size fits all, but take a look at Tuvalu, for example. If you've never heard of Tuvalu, it's the country that owns the domain name of the website .tv. Okay, so twitch.tv, I don't know, what else has .tv? A lot of things have .tv, but .tv is owned by Tuvalu. You've never heard of the country, but you've definitely heard of the domain name, okay? It's a chain like of islands that only hosts that's only home to like a couple tens of thousands of people. Not many people at all, right? Yeah, it's not television. All domain names basically are owned by country except for like .com, .net, and stuff like that. For example, .gg, which is used by a lot of gaming stuff like op.gg and a lot of gaming esports teams, is actually owned by Guernsey, which is like an island owned by England. So that's weird. That's something interesting. You can look up that stuff. It's pretty interesting to see. But .tv, Tuvalu, it's an island chain in the Pacific, right? And it's not home to many people, but it is home to people. And what's going to happen is within the next few decades, Tuvalu will most likely just be underwater. They don't have the infrastructure, right, to build like a bunch of walls around their islands because they're not the richest. In fact, a large proportion of their money is just made by licensing .tv, which can tell you something about the size of their economy. Tuvalu is going to be underwater pretty soon, and there is not much we can do about it. But here's the thing. Did they contribute to themselves going underwater? Zero. They didn't contribute anything. Tuvalu's emissions are virtually nothing when it comes to global carbon emissions, and yet they're the ones that are facing the punishment. So that's exactly what climate change exacerbates. The impacts are disproportionately felt by the poorest, most vulnerable worldwide. Okay? That's something that's super interesting. And I'm going to discuss just a few more reasons why this is true and how this is true and why it's such a social issue and a racial issue as much as it is a scientific issue. So, before I get deeper into any one topic, though, climate change directly contributes to these things. Widening social and racial inequality, like I said. Ocean acidification, which is when the ocean's water becomes more acidic, which means our food sources are impacted. Natural disasters makes them worse and more frequent. Refugees causes refugees. And wars. This actually directly contributes to wars, and we'll see how for a second. There's a reason why climate change is called a threat multiplier, right? Because it is. It's the one thing that's a catalyst for everything else. So let's talk about, yeah.
Like even the US government, the same one that denies that climate change is like this man-made threat, like they've called it a threat multiplier, like the US Navy, they've done simulations of it. We've already started to see like wars in places like Pakistan indirectly over it. And then the other thing too, this is just like a more general thing, but I'm sure you've all heard of Pascal's wager. Basically, and it can be like extended to climate change as well. Let's say climate change isn't caused by man-made activity, and we do end up trying to fight climate change anyway. Great. We get ourselves off of a resource that has been scientifically proven to pollute our environment and is a finite tool. But let's say climate change is a real threat and we ignore the impacts, then we're literally going to have like tens of millions of people that die, large swaths of climate refugees, many animals that go extinct. And so the harm of being wrong is a lot worse than the harm of being right, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The argument, the classic argument that's used is like when people say, I mean, oh, the planet warming is just natural, right? It's a natural cause. It's a natural cycle. Why does it matter? Well, I mean, sure. You know what else is natural? Getting cancer is natural, but that doesn't mean you don't want to fight it, right? That doesn't mean you don't want to treat it. Even if it is a natural cycle, we do know that that natural cycle is going to end up wiping a bunch of humans out of the earth. So, I mean, why don't we solve it? So that's the real issue. And that's the real like problem with climate discourse. There's so much like bad faith arguments, so much stuff that doesn't make any sense coming out like from people.
Brian.
Yeah.
Can you repeat those facts?
Yeah. So the problem is just that there's just so much garbage just coming out of climate deniers and stuff. It's really easy to spot holes in those arguments. But let's talk about the first part, how climate change exacerbates inequality, both racial and social. Let's talk about a few scenarios. First of all, we've already established that climate change can make like natural disasters worse. Or if we haven't established that, I'm establishing it now. They make hurricanes worse, they make wildfires worse, etc. So when a natural disaster strikes a place, like the people who have the most means to get out are generally richer. Because like in cities in the Eastern Hemisphere, generally the poor people live lower, more centralized, kind of in slums. Therefore, when floods strike the city, they get impacted the most, right? That's pretty logical. Furthermore, around the world, 30% of the people live in like arid, dry, desert kind of areas. And the people that live there are disproportionately poorer and ethnic minorities, right? And when that actually happens, when climate change gets hotter and makes them uninhabitable, they're going to have no place to go. So that already exacerbates inequality just based on where you're living and if you have the capacity to move. All right. For example, just take a look at a pair of hurricanes that happened in the US. Okay. Katrina in 2005 devastated New Orleans, but specifically the poor part of New Orleans where many more Black people were living. Okay. Largely because they didn't have the resources to get out, the recovery was bad, and also like when a slum gets wiped out, the government doesn't put as much priority in rebuilding the slums than like repairing other places, right? So the recovery from climate-induced disasters is way slower as well for poor people. And Maria, for example, Hurricane Maria hitting Puerto Rico, but because like our federal government didn't really care about them, they're worse off as well. So climate change exacerbates social inequalities and generally racial inequalities because racial inequalities tie into these social inequalities really, really clearly. As I said before, the second part is how when rich countries pollute the air, poor countries suffer, right? Tuvalu may be underwater within decades, but also like more desert countries that don't contribute a ton, like maybe in the Middle East, the ones that aren't oil, or sub-Saharan Africa for sure, they face the brunt of the impact. While more temperate climates like the suburbs of Chicago aren't facing the impacts, although Chicago as a city certainly pollutes more than many cities in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And as far as racial inequality, a more direct impact of environmental health is that people of color often live in areas or are just like zoned to areas that breathe the worst air and are subject to the worst environmental quality because like they don't have like lobbying power as a collective. Many like firms that build landfills and stuff like that will just build them next to poor neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods and communities just because they can and they don't face pushback, right? See Flint, Michigan as an example. So climate change just exacerbates everything already existing as divisions within our society.
Can I add a couple of things?
Yeah.
I think to that. So like on that first thing about like how it disproportionately affects poorer folks, also think about like the infrastructure in poor communities, in poor countries as well, right? You know, like you're more likely to see dirt roads, for example, in poor countries, which are more likely to get washed out by rising sea levels. So there's that sort of stuff. There's also the fact that if you look at slums, they're not built out of concrete or have that same structural integrity that those that wealthier folks tend to have in their homes. And so that's another way in which, they're more likely to be disproportionately affected by climate change. And then also when we talk about how people of color often breathe the worst air, I forget the specific numbers of the stat, but I remember there was this one public housing unit in Chicago back during like the 1950s, and had like 6,000 tenants, most of whom were Black. And I believe it was like 57% of all the toxic facilities and landfill areas surrounded that one public housing unit. So it's crazy to think about. And that's not all, right? This is compounded by the fact that healthcare in general tends to be worse in poor communities and poor countries. And so they're thus less likely to be able to get treated for these diseases, which is why you'll see rates of asthma are also significantly higher in these same neighborhoods as well.
Yeah, for sure. So let's take this into account and then see like the one major other area how climate change can really exacerbate these existing conditions. And that's the climate refugee problem, okay? So let's just ask ourselves a few questions. Like, what happens when Miami goes underwater, perhaps by 2100, and like the government doesn't have enough time to build like some wall or something to keep the water out, And what happens when large swaths of the Middle East or sub-Saharan Africa just get too hot and they become uninhabitable? Well, this is already happening to some degree, okay? NPR states that since 2008, an average of 24 million people per year are displaced due to natural disasters. And this number will only increase, okay? Let's just think about that. It's only going to get bigger. By 2050, over 140 million people could be displaced from the most arid regions, like sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And let's just take a step back and think about how the world has treated just like our current refugee problem, just with wars and stuff, with Syria, for example. I touched on this earlier in the Middle East presentation. It's been terrible. Countries don't want to take them in. Like, they really just are struggling under the strain of a population shock. And this is just from one war. What about 140 million people from the most arid regions? And for Samay's question, arid regions are affected worse just because like their harvest seasons and actual stuff is just like hard to come by in the first place. So with rising climate change, they might not be able to farm at all, right? Like if the temperature gets too high, where are they going to get food if their harvest is completely wiped out and it's just too hot? And look, most of those people living in arid regions are already living to like the extent at which humans can live in the heat. Like in summer, it's really, really hot. They need tons of air conditioning. And if it gets even hotter, it just creates a terrible situation. And also, climate change obviously leads to drought as well. So it's just food, water, space in general. So hopefully that answered your question. Yeah. So how can the world deal with this, right? Especially considering that like even temperate regions are going to be facing temperature rises of their own. Consider the fact that right now, climate refugees might as well not exist under international law. There's just no international designation for climate refugees, no protections, no recognition. So what needs to happen is that the UNHCR or HRC, right? Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council, I think that might be a typo, needs to like amend this accordingly and start, coming up with a plan to deal with this stuff. Because a lot of developed countries just don't want people coming in, which is fair. But is it really fair? Because you're the one causing them with all your pollution to leave their homes. So it's a moral issue, philosophical issue, economic issue, and a scientific issue, right? All of this is happening because of climate change, and it's going to force us to reckon with and deal with and make policies to the brink and extent of our ability to do so.
I have a couple things to add, I guess, Brian.
Yeah.
Just first off, I meant like the United Nations Higher Commission on Refugees.
Okay. Got you.
Yeah, and I agree with Brian. It's like this almost moment of bitter irony that the same countries which are disproportionately responsible for climate change are unwilling to accept, I guess, the consequences that come with it. It's like the mantra, you do the crime, you do the time, but the United States is not doing the time for that. The other thing too is, like, think about it like this. When you see these more arid regions become even hotter and hotter and hotter, as Brian talked about it, it'll lead to this perpetual feedback loop. So it becomes a lot harder to maintain homeostasis and keep, like, nice and cool temperatures, which is going to require even more energy to, then keep these houses cool, which is going to contribute to climate change even more. And one other thing, as a thought experiment, because we know that climate change is leading to refugees and it is leading to wars. And so a good example of this is Israel and Palestine. So recently, people heard about how Israel annexed the West Bank, and they were wondering why that's significant. And that's because the Gaza River goes through the West Bank in Israel. Maybe it's the Golan Heights. I'm not good at geography, right? But one of those areas, right? And so if Israel has control of that area, they can cut off the stream of water from the Jordan River downstream, which means that people in Palestine, for example, in the Palestinian slums, may not be able to get access to water. And so that can lead to climate refugees. And we're starting to see that leads to more crises. And there are other places too. There's examples of, like, water wars beginning to happen and instability happening in Pakistan and really all over the Middle East. So that's just the other thing to consider.
Yeah, it's just within the coming decades, we're going to see, like, by the time we are in our primes, right? We as a group, Gen Z as a group, I think some of the big issues we're going to have to reckon with is going to be, like, how are we going to get these resources? How are we going to allocate these resources? And how are we going to, like, move people accordingly? Like, that's the whole deal with SpaceX. Are we going to have to leave? Stuff like that. So that's going to be issues we're going to have to discuss in the very near future as well. And this is really the catchphrase, right? Climate change catalyzes catastrophe. It on its own, it's a concerning factor for our environment. Combined with the social institutions and social structures that we as a world have decided upon, it's catastrophic, right? And here are some reasons why. I've already talked about hurricanes and wildfires, but here's the rundown again. Hurricanes will get more frequent and more severe. Wildfire season will be longer as well. Remember, just in California and in Australia, wildfires were huge news just at the beginning of this year, just half a year ago, as far as that might seem. So that's really, really concerning, especially if they're going to get more intense, because obviously if a region is drier, fires spread easier because there's just no water to keep them out, right? So hurricanes and wildfires will get worse, and that will impact the poor people the most. This picture on the bottom left is ocean acidification. It's essentially when carbon dioxide gets in the air, but also leaches into our oceans, right? And when carbon dioxide gets into our oceans, it turns the pH levels down a bit. So it moves the pH levels more acidic. And the thing about most oceanic creatures is that they have a very, like, low niche of tolerance. They have a low fundamental niche. And in biological terms, that means that they really have a specific set of conditions that they thrive under. And pH is one of those things. So when the pH changes even slightly, that leads to vast swaths of things just dying out, like coral reefs, and fishery collapse across the world. So that's a food source, biodiversity source, and a cultural source of pride and resources that are just being deprived. And obviously, on the bottom right, these two pictures, food, hard to come by, right? Now, there are new advancements being made in, like, Monsanto and GMOs that can survive drought, but overall, food situation's worse when it's hotter. And this one, on the very bottom right, the water's going. Drought, rivers that used to be huge are just gone. Lakes that used to be huge, drying out, right? Water, big issue. So with all of these coming together, we can see why climate change is such a catastrophe. And this is just, all these pictures have already existed, right? Ocean acidification is happening. Hurricanes and wildfires are already getting worse. Drought and food wars and water wars are already ongoing. It's just going to get worse. And the main thing that people are going to realize is at some point it's going to start affecting them, right? Rather, it might be refugees trying to get into your city because they can't find anywhere else to live. That could be one way. It might be a hurricane or wildfire coming to you. Could be that. Or it just could be like food prices skyrocketing. At some point, this is going to impact you. And especially, we're going to talk about, Anant already touched on this war thing. But another example is, I touched on this in the Middle Eastern presentation I gave earlier today about how from 2007 to 2010, there was a severe drought in Syria. And a lot of people from the Syrian heartlands had to move to the cities, which caused a population shock, unrest, which indirectly led to protests and the eventual violent crackdown towards civil war. Climate change contributed to that drought, right? So climate change sparks wars and will contribute to future ones.
I found a really good statistic on this that might be interesting. So, quote, researchers at Princeton University and UC Berkeley found that a rise in average annual temperature by even 1 degree Celsius leads to a 4.5% increase in civil war that year. And then they list a couple examples, Syria being one, which Brian just talked about. The other one they talked about was what happened in Lake Chad, which is the 6th largest freshwater lake in the world. So what happened was there was this decade-long drought, which caused the lake to shrink. The drought was attributed to rising greenhouse gas emissions. And basically what happened was, since Lake Chad is this life source for a lot of countries, including folks who populate Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad, as the lake began to shrink, the surrounding population was forced to move toward it, right, in order to get to like the center of the shrinking lake. And they began competing for access. And so what that led was there was a measurable rise in confrontations between local farmers and herders and things like that. Yeah. So definitely climate change does contribute to wars. There's empirical evidence on it. There are tons of case studies. It really is a threat multiplier.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing where 1 degree is warming is going to be different from 2 degrees, and it's going to be different from 3 degrees, right? It's just a matter of how bad it gets, okay? Now, here's a part that we as extempers are super interested about. What can we do? What are some ways that we can actually get this problem under control? Because until now, this presentation basically has been doom and gloom. And really, it's going to continue being kind of doomy and gloomy because a lot of the stuff we can do is just change our entire system, right? The only thing that we can do that's like really proven to work is just like get ourselves to a zero carbon economy as quick as possible. But that's really not going to happen anytime soon, right? But that's the framework on which everything operates. Here are some key tenets on climate action, okay? Individual action is not and will not be enough. We've all heard throughout elementary school that we need to, as individuals, reuse, reduce, recycle, blah, blah, blah. Man, buy an electric car. Like, let's go. Come on, turn your lights off when you leave the room, right? We hear that time and time again that that's the solution. And it's really not, okay? Just as proof, look at this year. This year, we had the grandest experiment. It was an accidental experiment, but the grandest experiment possible on reducing individual greenhouse gas emissions across the world. And that was COVID-19. Everyone had to stay home. We couldn't go anywhere. Cars were not, planes were weighed down. We couldn't really do industry. But even as individuals drop their work levels and drop their carbon emissions, we're only projected to like reduce carbon emissions by 5.5% this year. And in order for us to meet goals, we need to drop our carbon emissions by 7.6% per year for the next decade, right? According to some projections. So even if every individual makes the maximum effort, which we were doing for a few months this year, it's just not enough. Yeah. Anand, did you say something?
I was just going to say you were a little bit frozen toward the end, but it just was like, the stuff all did get out at the end, but it was just like a little bit laggy. I would say this too, like individually, we cannot completely stop climate change, but I don't think that necessarily negates the importance of individual action, I guess. Like, obviously don't just like buy one of those diesel guzzling trucks and, coal roll just for fun. Like you still want to have like some reasonable limitations. The other thing too is that 71% of all carbon dioxide emissions come from 100 companies. And so that's something that's, I wouldn't say interesting, but I don't know the right word, but it's just something to look at. And I think it goes back to Brian's point about the importance of having policy change and more macro change rather than micro change.
Yeah, I think individual action at this point, its main use is to just like change the mentality, right? As individual action is more of kind of like a peer pressure effect, really, rather than having any tangible effect. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. 100 companies, 71% of emissions, that's a regulatory issue. That's a regulatory issue. The second main point I want to make is that while there are technologies out there that, if developed far enough, could theoretically save us just on the spot. For example, if we develop carbon capture enough that it could literally suck out all the carbon in the atmosphere, it could save us on the spot. It would just be foolish to hope that they do so, okay? It's not worth banking all of our hope on these new technologies. Thus, while technologies are really important, the brunt of the legwork has to revolve around policy and the tools we have right now. We really do have the tools to solve the crisis, or most of the crisis now. What we lack is the political will, okay? I'll give you an example. In 2017, there was a study done by Stanford professor Mark Z. Jacobson, which outlined a path for 139 countries to get to 100% renewable energy by like 2050, okay? He outlined a path and everything, showing that it was possible. We're just lacking the political will to get there, okay? That's simply put, we just don't have the will to do it. That's why the legwork needs to be policy. But that's the scary thing too, because we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of policy right now. Now, one of the most ambitious policy frameworks then that has been proposed is the Green New Deal. And Biden's climate plan takes a lot of stuff from the Green New Deal. But what actually is the Green New Deal? It's a framework, okay? The framework says that we really want to get 100% renewable energy, definitely by 2050, maybe by like 2030. I forget the specifics of the Green New Deal, but it's like an economic change as well, like creates green jobs, invests in green technology, while also being like creates new green buildings, cuts down on like air travel and stuff like that, while also being like an environmental change where we just phase out non-renewable energy. It also sets a goal, but how we get there is the real issue, right? It can lay out all these goals. We need a path to get there. So there kind of is a path to get there for energy, at least. As far as the energy revolution goes, we're in an okay spot. Renewables right now are growing and rolling out at their fastest pace ever. They're projected to grow by 50% within the next half decade. And we can couple this with the fact that wind and solar are actually just on track to be cheaper than coal worldwide. And we have a nice market-based progression into an energy revamp in the electricity sector. So electricity can soon be largely renewable if we had regulatory assistance along with the market just following its way. Because right now we're giving like a lot of coal subsidies, which is ridiculous. Okay, we have coal and natural gas subsidies. We should really be subsidizing renewables more. So electricity, feasibly, yes, we could get there. Renewables could in large part replace coal, natural gas decently soon. The question is that like there's still a ton of natural gas out there, so we don't really have an incentive to get off it yet. The main issue energy-wise is oil. Okay? Right now, we do not have a viable solution for replacing oil. It's just too valuable for transportation, and its density is too convenient, and we've recently discovered so much new oil that we're not in danger of running out anytime soon, okay? So that's why oil is just the king of fuel as far as cars, planes, trucks go. Just far superior to carrying loads on vehicles. Electric vehicles just cannot do as much as oil can for like big jobs like trucks and stuff. So that's why renewables are great for generating electricity, but we use energy for other things like fuel, right? That's why we do need some technological advances. For example, oil, there's a discussion around biofuels, right? You can use ethanol maybe or other potentially renewable, they call it, energy sources. The problem is that like you would still have to mix it in with some oil. Ethanol still emits carbon. There's a bunch of just issues around this. So oil is the big deal. If someone can make an electric car or an electric truck that does the same thing as an oil truck, you know, and especially an electric plane, then we can start talking about replacing oil. But at the moment, oil is king as far as transportation, and transportation is a large part of our carbon budget. So we either need to find a way to make oil obsolete or counteract its effect on carbon emissions. But there's one other energy source that I think is often overlooked, and this is kind of an editorial decision on my part to include this, because a lot of climate activists just ignore nuclear entirely. But nuclear is like clean, okay? It's clean. There are no carbon emissions. It's zero. It's just water vapor that's released and nuclear waste, right? That's the issue. Public interest in nuclear is kind of diminished, especially after like Chernobyl and the Japanese disasters in 2011 or 2010. Disasters of this scale have made nuclear kind of a bogeyman when it comes to electricity. But the issue is that like nuclear is actually quite safe in its current iteration, especially with new advances in tech that have given us potential things like molten salt reactors. If you do some research, I can't explain it scientifically, but they're just way safer, way smaller, and they could be a key factor in a greener economy. Nuclear is actually really convincing. Like we should be using nuclear in order to transition from fossil fuels to a 100% renewable economy because it's clean, right? The problem is though, it faces political pressure. For example, just the debate over where to store nuclear waste is a big debate. Earlier this century, the U.S. had already picked out a site, Yucca Mountain. It's in Nevada. That we were going to take all the nuclear waste and just store it under a big mountain. However, that went out the window when in 2008, Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, who is a Democrat, made a deal with Barack Obama, who was in a fierce primary fight with Hillary Clinton. Harry Reid basically told Obama that he would endorse him for president if Obama promised him that he would not put nuclear waste in Yucca Mountain in Nevada, because Harry Reid was from Nevada. That was his parting retirement gift to the world, making sure that we had nowhere to store nuclear waste. And this is a perfect, well, not the world, he's still alive, but to the Senate. But this is basically a perfect example of NIMBY politics, NIMBY, not in my backyard. You see this all the time with like homeowners associations and like suburban moms, but like NIMBY politics, perfect example, Yucca Mountain. And that's the political pressure nuclear faces. So that's a big problem, obviously. But the takeaway basically, yeah, Anand.
Can you go back a couple slides to like the oil one?
Yeah.
So here's the other thing about oil, and just like emphasizing why government subsidies make such a big difference. 50% of all new oil fields would not be profitable without US government subsidies. A similar percentage, about half of all coal plants, would go completely bankrupt if it weren't for US subsidies. So in short, these gratuitous handouts by our federal government and state governments make it so that what should be a competitive energy market really isn't. And if you want some specifics on the Green New Deal, I can provide those. I was just doing some research on that. Basically, it's like 62,000 US citizens die of air pollution annually. And so it's becoming this big issue to combat. So what a Green New Deal would do is it incorporates an environmental framework with a socially conscious framework, recognizing that the brunt of environmental issues falls disproportionately on lower income people and specifically people of color. And so that's why you have green and New Deal. Green plus New Deal equals the Green New Deal. So basically it'd be upgrading all existing buildings through a $340 billion plan, improving their energy efficient standards, investing $180 billion to retrofit public housing, which basically means, from my understanding, you like remove certain parts and add new parts that would be more environmentally friendly on existing buildings. And then also creating jobs programs and like other sorts of targeted programs to, one, retrain current workers who may lose their jobs in the green wave, and two, helping unemployed folks, especially in poor communities, get new jobs. Also going to Brian's note about nuclear energy, like it really is a contentious issue amongst environmental activists, and it was a big debate amongst people who wrote the Green New Deal. Keep in mind it is a non-binding piece of legislation, which means even if it passes, it doesn't actually do anything. It's just the blueprint. But they decided that no, nuclear energy was not going to have a future in our energy portfolio, which is also something I think personally was ill-advised, just like Brian does.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, nuclear is a really contentious issue among progressives, sunrise movement. Personally, I think it's necessary just because I don't think we have the will to go straight to renewables. So we'll see. So the takeaway, renewables are just one part of the solution, right? Here are some of the other solutions I'll just give a passing mention to that I'll explain. That climate activists generally agree like shouldn't be the main focus, okay? And the moonshot solutions are just those. Moonshot solutions that could potentially get us out of the issue. There are two main ones. Carbon capture and solar radiation management, or SRM. So carbon capture. The aforementioned 2018 IPCC report states that carbon capture, which is essentially taking carbon out of the atmosphere, is necessary to avoid catastrophe. And we've already developed some stuff, right? Some carbon capture technology. The issue is the incentive to use it. Carbon capture takes a large investment, a ton of space, and has very little commercial payoff. Just think about it, right? Who is the market for carbon capture technology? Ideally, the market would be oil companies, coal companies, and like plane companies that would install this tech to capture their carbon from their activities, right? But what's the incentive for those companies to buy carbon capture? Nothing. And therefore, there is no incentive for carbon capture technology to like really be made. So that's why we need regulatory support, because there's no like natural demand for carbon capture. It offers nothing except for it doesn't pollute. And that's why it needs regulatory support. The US government needs to say needs to mandate that companies like start capturing their carbon, and then we can see a faster rollout of this technology, right? So while it is required carbon capture in some form to stay below the 1.5 degree threshold, it doesn't need to be a huge amount of carbon capture to avoid utter catastrophe. So if we just get a decent amount of carbon capture and actually follow through with the transition to renewables, we'll be dealing with like a minor catastrophe. It's still a catastrophe, but it's mitigated, okay? Thus, technologically, we should definitely be doing more research and investment in carbon capture. Financially, as I said, there's just no incentive. Now, carbon capture is generally like accepted as a good tool for us to consider. And this next one is very, very contentious, maybe even more so than nuclear power, because it's solar radiation management. What this means is essentially we're just trying to block out the sun's rays. Like, who cares if we've already burned through the ozone or whatever? Like, who cares if we've got so much greenhouse gas magnifying the rays? We're just going to block it out. Essentially, it's geoengineering and reversing like weather at a very large scale. Not reversing weather, but reversing the sun's rays just so the earth doesn't get as hot. It seems crazy. That's because it is. Some ideas include cloud thinning, solar mirrors in the sky, literally putting mirrors in the sky, and aerosol injection. So the most promising idea is some form of aerosol injection. But all of these ideas have like side effects, which make them so controversial. Like aerosol injection mimics a volcano, because like if when a super volcano erupts, it causes a cooling effect like across the whole planet, because there's just so much soot and compounds in the air that it really blocks out the sun's rays. Aerosol injections are a similar idea, where I think generally sulfur dioxide would be the thing you're injecting. The issue is that, cloud seeding is different. Cloud seeding is different. Cloud seeding is where you seed clouds so that they like rain at the right time. That's not aerosol injection, but it is another form of geoengineering. Aerosol injection is essentially injecting the air with like sulfur dioxide so that it provides that like repellent effect. The problem is that sulfur dioxide is also the main component of acid rain. So there's a big side effect of all sorts of solar radiation management that you guys can do some reading on. But in large part, climate activists don't like solar radiation management. Green New Deal advocates don't like solar radiation management because they see it as like a crazy, like stupid idea that we shouldn't be researching. Personally, I think, yeah, we shouldn't rely on this stuff, but I think we should research it. I mean, we might need it one day. Like, if we're like super on the brink, we might use it to, like, it's better than nothing, right? In the face of catastrophe. So that's that as far as solutions. Yeah, technologically. Yeah, None?
Brian, so I just want to like add a couple other solutions, and then maybe you can give your 2 cents on the viability of it. First would be like mass scale carbon offsetting, so like just like some huge tree planting initiative or something like that to offset carbon emissions. Would that be a viable solution?
Yeah, I mean, I heard about that. For example, like Ethiopia, I think, planted a ton of trees just last year to do something about that. The issue is that, like, if you, like, a report I read, or like this article I read citing a report said that just using like actual carbon capture technology to get us to Paris would like force the carbon fields to be like 2 to 3 times the size of India. And I have to assume that trees are less efficient at capturing carbon than like carbon capture tech. So I assume the space required for trees alone to solve our problems would be huge, right? But I think trees like and offsetting definitely has to play a part. So I think, yeah, it should be done, but it won't like just solve everything.
All right, what about this next solution? Basically, super stringently regulating oil and gas companies, preventing them from drilling in a ton of new places, and removing their subsidies.
Yeah, okay, if you remove the subsidies, first of all, that would
And it
really
looks like you're frozen.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Uh,
Can you hear me?
wait. Okay, now it's better.
Yeah. Basically, first of all, if you just remove the subsidies, like that's already great onto the market-based solutions, right? Because the market would just act and we'd shift more towards renewables in that case. But yeah, regulation is what's needed. Like even instead of just like limiting where they can drill and stuff, maybe like just force them to offset their carbon. You know what I mean? It's that sort of like huge regulatory action that we need.
Yeah.
And definitely that has to play a part with oil and gas companies. Yeah.
What about infrastructure upgrades? So upgrading our infrastructure and like buildings and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. That will play a part, right? But that's another part of the whole. The main idea has to be decarbonizing our economy, and buildings are a part of that, right? So that just plays a role in how we do that. Like, I don't think people realize how much of a societal change it's going to require, right? Just because they don't want to think about it. But it's going to be a huge effort with input from a ton of different areas, right? And actions in a ton of different areas.
Okay. What about having people move closer to work? You know, maybe improving public transportation and emphasizing that sort of stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Like a high-speed railway system.
Yeah, for sure. California, like high-speed rail has big obstacles in the U.S. just because of how the U.S. is laid out. So that might not be something, but definitely improving public transport within cities so that like people don't have to like drive everywhere is definitely big. But also like if we keep the cars, we have to like make them more electric cars or electric buses, for example, electric planes. Technological advances will also play a role in that. just every facet of life has to put in some form of work.
All right. What about this one? Going vegetarian or maybe decreasing meat consumption. I know we're exploring like really weird options with that, like the consuming of bugs, for example, has been.
Oh yeah. Individually.
And all that.
Yeah. Individually, eating less meat means nothing, right? I mean, sure. But systematically, reducing the amount of meat that's being produced is an idea, yeah? Because meat contributes like to carbon emissions a ton. Just the meat industry in general, if you look it up, it contributes a ton to climate change. So, yeah, not necessarily you yourself eating less meat, because I don't think it does anything. I mean, I'm a pescatarian myself, so I eat fish and stuff, but not like poultry or meat. But I don't think it does anything. But large scale, like reducing factory farming, definitely, yeah, it will.
Okay, what about this? This one's a more like, I guess, really heavy government approach, but like a one-child sort of policy.
Yeah, that's another thing, right? Just a growing population causes more emissions, but there are ways to get to solving this crisis without forcing that onto people, right? Without enforcing that rule. So there's no need to do that if we do the other stuff.
Okay. Sorry for all like the solutions. I just want like people to get like an idea of the different stuff.
We just need an idea. Yeah, you're gonna have to understand that this is a multifaceted problem.
What about refrigerant management?
I thought we already dealt with that. Refrigerants and CFCs were what caused the large hole in the ozone before, but since we banned those in like Stockholm or something, largely the ozone hole's getting back together. So I think that's actually a story of us succeeding in something environmentally, where the ozone layer is repairing itself.
And one last question, and this is more of a philosophical one. But should we be focused on a mitigation strategy toward climate change? Preventing happening, or an adaptation one?
Yeah.
Where we affect the impacts of climate change once they're already there. Which one is the more ergonomic approach, and which one's like the more viable approach, I guess?
For sure. More viable adaptation, 100%, right? I mean, come on. If I was thinking in an idealistic term, mitigation is possible, right? It's possible. But is it plausible in our current political state? We'll have to see. I think November is the most important election in a while, just because of this issue. So we'll see how everything works out. But yeah, it's possible. Is it plausible? I don't know. Adaptation, especially the refugee issue, we're gonna have to do it. Like adaptation is gonna be necessary. Mitigation is like a dream that might come true.
So I said one more last question, but I guess just a follow up to that then. What would adaptation measures look like? Is that like building up seawalls, for example? Moving people closer inland? Is it like improving the infrastructure of current buildings that are close to the coast? Because I know 40% of people worldwide live on coastal areas. So what does that mean when we talk about that?
That's for sure. The Netherlands is a great example. They're already doing stuff. The Netherlands have literally already been building seawalls in Amsterdam and stuff, because Amsterdam's below sea level actually, and sea levels are rising. So they're really actually keeping seawalls. So that's a big idea. Yes, for sure, seawalls. Yes, for sure, improving infrastructure to make them stronger to natural disasters, definitely. And yeah, moving inland is definitely an individual plan. I don't see a plan where the government would start paying people to move inland. I just don't see that happening. But moving inland is definitely an option. Andrew Yang said it in a debate, like we should be looking for higher ground. I mean, we should. So there's just a lot of stuff that we can throw out to adapt. And more so just adapting globally, we need a framework and a method to deal with like climate refugees. I think that's really important for adaptation. Where are these people going to go, and how are we going to support them? I think that's a main issue for adaptation worldwide.
You know where climate refugees are currently going? Because like if no one's accepting them, and we talked about how they're like over 20 million climate refugees each year, what's happening to them right now? Are they just being forced to move inland? And are we going to invariably start to see some conflicts then over those resources like we saw in the Chad Basin?
Yeah, we definitely will see more conflict. And I'm not sure where these climate refugees are going. But for example, like like when regular refugees were denied at the U.S. border, like with the whole caravan thing, they had to just go back to Mexico or like try, like they're just in limbo. So they're in a very bad situation. They will be as well if we don't figure out a framework to,
Yeah.
to deal with it.
The definition of refugee beyond just someone who's escaping from like political persecution or something that threatens their life to like include climate change in that framework as well.
For sure. Finally, this last slide I want to talk about is how change shouldn't need to come from finance, but it will come from financial institutions and business. Earlier this year, BlackRock CEO, who is BlackRock is one of the biggest private investment firms in the nation and world, certainly, wrote a letter to its CEO, wrote a letter to its investor. The CEO wrote his annual letter to investors, and in it, he stated that investment strategies in the future will have to center around climate change, because investments simply aren't safe if you aren't taking into account how the climate will play a role. So that's really important. And as more financial institutions, banks, for example, start listening to that and start taking that into account, that might be what drives change. As silly as it might seem, it just might be market and financial institutions. So yeah, that wraps it up for what I have. Obviously, this picture is meant to symbolize how we as a generation and the next generation and the generation after that is going to have to deal with this stuff. But I don't have anything else. So if you guys have questions, feel free to ask them. We don't have too much planned for the end of the day, mostly just
any book do you have book recommendations for this topic? If not books, think tanks or sources?
Heck yeah, bro. The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth I don't know how to pronounce it. Colbert. It's like Stephen Colbert, but with a K. That book goes into the biodiversity impact we're having on the environment. So the Sixth Extinction. I read an article in the New York Magazine. It's called The Uninhabitable Earth, that has recently been released as a book. Which really details the extent of this climate issue. So the Sixth Extinction. Oh, Earth, not book. Uninhabitable book. No, Uninhabitable Earth. Which is also decent. There's just other think tanks, for example. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES. There's a couple other ones that kind of focus on climate, but that's the main one I use. And generally, like, there's information everywhere about the climate crisis, like that you can find. So those are just a few of the recommendations I have.
Looks like everyone is heading back to the main room from the social inequalities lecture. If you have any last minute questions, Brian is literally like your go-to guy on just about anything related to climate change. Super knowledgeable on that affair. So any last minute questions before we head back to the main room? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, well, it doesn't look like it. So Brian and everyone else on this call, we're free to head back to the main room, and then we'll talk about actualizing some of those plans. Oh, and we'll be doing Satan speeches.
Cool.
Looking forward to that. All right.
Oh.
If Anu's still here, that's...
No, she left, but we gave her a Zoom applause. Don't worry.
Okay, that's awesome. Who's still recording, by the way?
Oh, that's me.
Yeah, I might want to stop that, but